Welcome to Reform Thinking. Usually when you talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of clinical precision.
Right, you want it to be clear.
Yeah, it operates a bit like structural engineering. You break your arm, you go into the clinic, the doctor puts the x-ray up on the light board, and they just point to that jagged white line on the screen and say, well, there it is. That is the fracture.
It is visible and it is categorized.
Yes, and you can comprehend it at a single glance.
Because we prefer things to be binary, I think. Broken or not broken. Benign or malignant.
Right.
We want a clean assessment that fits into neat little conceptual boxes. It just makes the world feel manageable.
It really does.
Yeah.
But then you step out of the realm of physical bone fractures and into the world of ancient linguistics, historical theology, and human nature, and suddenly that pristine x-ray machine just shatters.
Oh, completely.
You look at the diagnostic landscape of the human condition across history, and it is incredibly murky. The lines are not clean. The categories bleed into one another. And that brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today.
We have quite the stack of source material to get through.
We really do. We are looking at a massive stack of texts. We have standard Greek lexicons like BDAG, theological dictionaries like Kittle's massive multi-volume set, and translated historical papyri pulled from the dry sands of Egypt.
All of that to look into one specific thing.
Right. We're taking all of this dense academic material to investigate a single, fascinating ancient word family. The root word we are tracking is Allassō.
And for you listening, analyzing a single Greek root verb might sound like the driest possible academic exercise.
Oh, for sure. It sounds like a textbook.
But I promise you, it is the absolute opposite. This specific linguistic root acts as a bridge.
A really wide bridge, too.
Yeah, it connects the mundane act of changing your clothes to ancient Greek divorce proceedings, to the bizarre biological habits of hyenas, all the way to the most staggering, earth-shattering cosmic events in Christian theology.
The linguistic map here is genuinely extraordinary. When you read through the historical sources, both the biblical texts and the secular writings of the Greco-Roman world, you watch this one verbal concept get stretched across an incredibly vast spectrum of human experience.
So we are going to examine the fundamental anatomy of this word today.
Yes, we will look at how its meaning morphs and shifts when different Greek prefixes are attached to the front of it. And most significantly, we will analyze how the writers of the New Testament leverage those specific shifts to communicate the sheer objective weight of what God has done in human history.
The best way I can think to visualize this for you is to compare looking at a root word to looking at a multi-generational family tree.
I like that analogy.
You start with the patriarch, the original ancestor. You get to know his face, his defining characteristics, his general temperament. Then, as you move down the historical branches of that tree, you suddenly spot the family resemblance in completely different cousins separated by centuries.
Even if they look totally different on the surface.
Right. They might live in different countries, speak different dialects, and hold entirely different occupations, but they share that undeniable core DNA.
So let us start with the patriarch of this particular family, the root word Allassō. Based on what our lexicons show us, this verb derives from an even simpler adjective, allos, which simply means other.
Just a basic concept of otherness.
Yeah, and from that basic concept, Allassō develops two primary branches of meaning. The first is to make something different, to alter its fundamental nature or appearance. The second branch is to exchange or substitute one thing for another.
Those two branches give us a solid base for everything that follows in the biblical text, but we need to consider the secular, everyday usage of this word in the ancient world first. That is what grounds our understanding.
Because the writers in the New Testament were not writing in some elevated, mystical, holy language, right?
Precisely. They were writing in Koine Greek, which was the street language of the common people. So how did the common people use this word? Well, Artemidorus, who was a 2nd century professional diviner, used this word in his famous work on dream interpretation, the Oneirocritica.
I remember reading about that. He was talking about birds, I think.
Yes, he used it when describing ravens changing their pitch or their tone of voice. In his world, a raven altering its vocal frequency was not just biology. It was an omen.
Like a superstitious warning.
Yeah, it was a tactile, physical shift in the air that meant something terrifying or auspicious was about to happen.
That physical, tactile nature is everywhere in the sources. I mean, the author of the early Christian text, the Epistle of Barnabas, used this specific word to describe a rather bizarre, ancient biological myth.
Oh, the hyenas.
Yes, the hyenas. They actually believed that a hyena could change its biological sex from year to year. Now, obviously, their biology was completely wrong, but the way they used the word ἀλλάσσω shows us they meant a literal, physical alteration of a creature's nature.
It was a very concrete idea for them.
Right. And you look at apocalyptic texts like The Shepherd of Hermas, where the author describes a visionary tower being built, and the stones making up the tower are physically changing colors.
And we even have access to thousands of ancient papyri from everyday civic life, which is fascinating.
Oh, like the trash heaps they dug up in Egypt.
Yeah, things like tax receipts, legal complaints, and building contracts. In those documents, Allassō details the swapping out of defective stones in a local building project, or simply the act of a citizen changing their dirty tunic for a clean one.
Which tells us something crucial about how the ancient mind categorized reality. Whether it was the acoustic frequency of a bird, the supposed biological mutation of an animal, the structural integrity of a brick, or the fabric of a garment, this word handled the concrete, observable, physical alterations of the material world.
It was not an abstract philosophical construct debated by Plato in the academy. It was a word you used on a construction site or at the public laundry.
And that tactile, everyday quality carries right over into the biblical texts. The New Testament writers do not suddenly elevate the word into the clouds. Like in Galatians 4:20, Paul is incredibly frustrated with the church in Galatia.
He is very visibly annoyed in that letter.
Very annoyed. He is writing this intense, corrective letter, and he says he wishes he could be present with them and change his tone of voice. He uses ἀλλάσσω. He wants to shift from the harsh medium of ink and parchment to a softer, physical, vocal cord vibration.
That is a great example, and we see it again in Acts 6:14 during the trial of Stephen. The religious leaders bring an accusation against Jesus, claiming that Jesus will change the customs handed down by Moses.
Again, alas.
Right. It is a word about practical, observable, sociological, and cultural alteration.
But the tension arrives when you look at how the writers apply this mundane vocabulary to cosmic events. The writer of Hebrews, quoting the Psalms, looks at the vast expanse of the physical universe, the stars, the planets, the entire celestial structure, and says in Hebrews 1:12 that the heavens will be folded up like a mantle, and like a garment they will be changed.
He uses the exact same word a Greek citizen would use for swapping out a dirty toga.
And then Paul does something even more striking in his first letter to the Corinthians. In chapter 15, verses 51 and 52, he is dealing with the absolute climax of human history, the final judgment and the resurrection of the dead.
The biggest event imaginable.
Yeah, and he writes, "We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. The dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed." Alas.
That is where I hit a conceptual wall when reading through these lexicons.
Me too. Because if you are the Apostle Paul and you are trying to describe the apocalyptic culmination of the universe, the dead bursting out of the ground, mortality being swallowed up by life, the eschatological horizon finally arriving, why on earth would you choose a word associated with swapping a bad brick or changing a shirt?
It seems almost entirely insufficient for the gravity of the event.
Right. Why would he not pull a highly elevated mystical term from Greek philosophy to describe the resurrection body?
Well, because pulling a mystical, ethereal term from Greek philosophy would have communicated the complete opposite of what Paul intended. You have to look at the cultural battleground of the first century.
The early church was constantly fighting against early forms of Gnosticism, right?
Yes, Gnosticism and Greco-Roman dualism. The prevailing cultural thought was that the physical material world was inherently bad, corrupt, and gross. The spiritual realm, the invisible world of ideas, was pure and good.
So matter equals bad, spirit equals good.
That is the basic summary. For a Greek philosopher, salvation meant your soul escaping the prison of the physical body to float away into an ethereal, ghostly realm.
Right, the body was just a temporary shell you could not wait to discard.
Spot on. But the biblical worldview violently rejects that dualism. God created the physical world, and he called the dirt, the trees, and the human body very good. Redemption is not God scrapping the physical universe, it is God restoring it.
Oh, so the vocabulary choice is a theological defense mechanism.
Exactly that. If Paul uses an abstract, mystical term for the resurrection, he risks his audience thinking the resurrection is just a spiritual evaporation. By using ἀλλάσσω, a word rooted in the dirt, the laundry, and the construction site, Paul insists on the tangible physical reality of the resurrection body.
The alteration at the end of the age is a hard, concrete, structural alteration of matter.
Yes, your current body is the old garment. The resurrection body is the new garment. The continuity of the person remains, but the nature of the physical material is completely altered to become imperishable.
The mundane vocabulary anchors the eschatological hope in physical reality. It tells you that the cosmic events of the future will be as real and solid as the clothes on your back right now.
The ordinary language forces the reader to reckon with the physical reality of the spiritual promises. God is not running a salvage operation where he throws away the material world to save a few floating souls. He is executing a physical renovation of the material he originally called good.
So we are looking at a verbal root that handles the physical exchange of goods just as easily as it handles the physical alteration of vocal cords. But now we need to track how this neutral concept of exchange moves down the family tree into a completely tragic application.
We are moving to a new cousin in the linguistic family.
Right, so if we take our root word ἀλλάσσω and we attach the prefix meta to the front of it, we get the compound verb antallagma. And this specific variation takes us straight into the darkest diagnostic assessment of human history, found in the opening chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans.
The addition of the prefix meta is significant here. In Greek composition, meta often carries the idea of transfer, a change of place, or a shift in condition.
Like metamorphosis.
Yes, a massive change. When compounded with our root, metallassō intensifies the concept of exchanging one thing for another, often implying a complete switch of allegiances or states.
And Paul uses it to describe a massive failure.
He really does. In Romans chapter 1, verses 23, 25, and 26, Paul deploys this intensified word to diagnose the fundamental fracture in the human condition. The text outlines a sequence of disastrous events.
Right. It starts with humanity knowing God.
But they did not honor him as God. Instead, they took the glory of the immortal God and exchanged it, metallassō, for images resembling mortal man, birds, animals, and creeping things.
And verse 25 reiterates the core of this tragedy, stating they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator.
I want to look at the Old Testament background for a second, because the lexicons point out that Paul is not inventing this concept of a tragic theological exchange out of thin air.
Oh, right. It has roots in the Hebrew texts.
Yeah, if you read the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, this use of metallassō directly mirrors the Hebrew root mer. That Hebrew word means to exchange, to barter, or to trade, particularly in the context of idolatry.
I think you see that glaringly in Psalm 106, which recounts the Israelites at Mount Sinai.
That is the perfect example.
They have the literal fiery presence of Yahweh on the mountain, the God who just split the Red Sea for them. And the psalm says they exchanged their glorious God for the image of a bull that eats grass.
The sheer absurdity of that visual is intentional. You have the infinite, sovereign creator of the cosmos, the source of all life and reality, and humanity looks at that infinite worth and says, well, we will trade this for a statue of a farm animal.
It is insulting, honestly.
It is. The lexicon sources highlight that the truth of God in Romans 1 is not just an abstract list of theological propositions. It is the self-revelation of God, the objective reality of who he is as the creator and sustainer of all things.
So the lie is the idolatrous system that places created things, whether that is a wooden statue, a political system, human intellect, or bodily pleasure in the position of the creator. It is an economic transaction gone entirely wrong.
Let us unpack the mechanics of that transaction, because calling it an economic failure reveals so much about human nature.
We are wired as creatures to assign value, right?
Yes, we are constantly making valuations in our minds. This is worth my time, that is not. This is worth my money, that is not. We are built to trade, and we are built to worship.
But our internal valuation system is entirely broken at the factory level. We consistently trade the priceless for the worthless.
Think of it like a massive corporate merger.
Okay, I am tracking with you. Imagine a Fortune 500 company.
Right. A company that possesses a limitless sovereign wealth fund, total market dominance, and perfect structural integrity.
And the board of directors willingly signs a contract to trade all of those assets to a competitor in exchange for a condemned, toxic landfill that is actively on fire.
That is exactly the scale of the disaster. And the terrifying part is not just the trade itself. It is that the board of directors sits at the table, signs the papers, and genuinely believes they secured the better end of the deal.
That corporate analogy clarifies the objective reality of the situation. It highlights the absolute irrationality of the fallen human mind. The trade is objectively suicidal, yet the participants celebrate it.
And Paul argues that this initial vertical swap, trading the creator for the creature, has severe structural consequences for human existence. Because humanity altered the natural religious order, the natural human order was subsequently fractured.
This is the explicit logic of Romans 1, right?
It is. And it is why verse 26 uses metalas again. Paul writes, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature."
The textual analysis here is vital. The terrible perversion of the natural biological and social order in human relationships is presented as the direct, just consequence for the sinful perversion of the facts in the religious sphere.
The vertical collapse dictates the horizontal collapse.
Precisely. When you barter away the creator, the entire structural integrity of human flourishing collapses underneath you. Humans are made in the imago Dei, the image of God. We are designed to reflect his glory.
And if you shatter the original object of worship, the reflection shatters as well.
You cannot divorce human morality or social order from human worship. The idolatry at the top of the chain poisons the water supply for everything downstream.
The transaction was completely disastrous. We traded away the infinite glory of God, and we acquired a curse, a state of rebellion, and a fractured existence.
And the brutal reality about a legal or economic transaction is that once the ink is dry and the trade is completed, reversing it requires capital. If you sell off your corporate assets for a toxic landfill, you cannot just wake up the next morning and ask for your assets back.
The other party holds the title.
Right. To get it back, you have to buy it back. But you only hold toxic assets. You are completely bankrupt. And this leads us to the next branch of our word family, where we encounter two new, highly specific variations of the root word, antallagma and Apallassō.
Let us start by looking at the first one, antallagma.
Okay, so the prefix antallag does not just mean against. In this context, it means in place of or equivalent to. So antallagma translates to purchase money, an equivalent, a ransom, or a substitute.
We find this word sitting at the center of one of the most sobering questions in all of ancient literature. In Mark 8:37 and the parallel passage in Matthew 16:26, Jesus looks at his audience and asks, "What can a man give in exchange for his soul?"
What is the antallagma for your life?
Yes. The theological dictionary we are referencing points out that this teaching is deeply rooted in Psalm 49, verses 7 and 8, which state unequivocally that truly no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life, for the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice.
I want to pause on the sheer weight of Mark 8:37, because it is so easy to read that as a sentimental verse about human value. People often read it as Jesus saying, look how incredibly valuable you are worth more than the whole world.
Which is a popular interpretation, but it misses the point.
It totally misses the historical context. While there is a truth to human value, the historical context of this word points to something far more severe. This is not a philosophical musing about the infinite abstract worth of a human soul in a vacuum. It is about the absolute infinite seriousness of divine judgment and legal debt.
The historical context of debt in the ancient world makes this vivid. In the first century, if you incurred a massive financial debt and could not pay it, you did not just declare bankruptcy and restructure your assets.
Your physical body became the collateral.
Yes, your physical body and often the bodies of your family members. You were thrown into debtor's prison or sold into slavery until the debt was paid. You were locked in a cell, and the only way out was if someone on the outside approached the creditor with a sufficient antallagma, a ransom, an equivalent sum of purchase money to buy your freedom.
So when Jesus asks, what can a man give in exchange for his soul? He is setting up an impossible audit.
An audit you cannot pass.
When the Creator requires your life, when the ledger of your existence is opened and the infinite debt of your rebellion against an infinite God comes due, there is no currency, no bribe, and no substitute you can offer to balance the scales.
The bankruptcy we discussed in Romans 1 means that humanity possesses nothing of sufficient value to reverse the transaction. We are sitting in the debtor's cell and our pockets are completely empty. We lack the antallagma.
Which leaves humanity in a state of absolute legal jeopardy. We are stuck in the binding contract of our own rebellion.
And that idea of a binding hostile contract leads beautifully into the second word in this section, Apallassō, Apollos. The prefix apo denotes separation, a moving away from something.
So this specific variation means to alter by removal, to do away with, to liberate, or to legally withdraw.
You find it utilized in Hebrews 2.15, where the author speaks of Christ liberating those who, through the fear of death, were subject to lifelong slavery.
The secular background of this word, however, provides a fascinating gritty context.
It really does.
According to the translated papyri and historical legal records, Apallassō was a technical legal term utilized in Greek marriage records for a wife's formal withdrawal during a divorce. It represented the legal severing of a two-sided relationship.
Furthermore, it was a standard business term for breaking free from a binding legal contract or settling a financial dispute out of court.
The legal and contractual flavor of the word seems to be exactly what the biblical writers want to highlight. In Luke 12.58, Jesus gives a practical illustration about settling with your accuser while you were still walking on the way to the magistrate.
He advises making an effort to settle the case out of court.
Yeah, and he uses this specific word, Apallassō, to say, make an effort to be free from him, or break away from the legal jeopardy before you reach the judge. It implies severing a hostile binding obligation.
But the usage that forces me to stop and reread the text is found in Acts chapter 19, verse 12.
The narrative surrounding Paul in Ephesus.
Yes. The text describes this extraordinary scenario where handkerchiefs or work aprons that physically touched the Apostle Paul were taken away to sick people, and the text says their diseases departed from them and the evil spirits came out.
And the Greek word used by Luke for the diseases departing is Apallassō. Now, Luke is a physician. He understands biology and illness. Yet he describes a medical condition, a biological disease, using the technical vocabulary of a broken business contract or a severed divorce arrangement.
It is a striking choice of words.
It is. Why would a doctor treat a virus or an infection like a divorced entity withdrawing from the human frame? I am struggling to see the logic of applying courtroom vocabulary to a medical healing.
It is a phenomenal linguistic choice that reveals the underlying theology of the biblical writers regarding the nature of the physical world. In the biblical worldview, disease, decay, and death are not natural, original components of the human design.
Right, they came later.
When God created the world, there was no cancer, no leprosy, no blindness. These biological corruptions are the direct penal results of the fall in Genesis 3. They are the physical manifestations of the curse of sin.
So they're tied to a legal judgment.
Therefore, sickness is not just a neutral biological accident. It holds a type of legal penal claim over the falling human body. It operates like a hostile creditor, enforcing the terms of a broken covenant upon a debtor.
Wait, so the disease actually has a contractual right to be there based on the rebellion of humanity?
In the broader theological sense, yes. The curse carries a legal weight. By using Apallassō, Luke frames the physical healing not simply as a biological repair, like fixing a broken bone, but as a legal liberation.
The disease is essentially being served an eviction notice from the highest court.
That is a perfect way to phrase it. Its contractual right to occupy that specific human body is being terminated by a higher sovereign authority. The illness is divorcing the patient. It is legally withdrawing its claim because the objective force of the kingdom of God, breaking into history through the ministry of Paul, has severed the legal bond of the curse in that specific moment.
It shows you that God's restoration addresses both the physical reality of the suffering and the underlying legal liability of the curse simultaneously.
That reframes the entire concept of healing. The disease acts as a collection agent for the curse, and the authority of God tears up the contract, forcing the agent to leave the premises.
So, to summarize the diagnostic trajectory for you listening, humanity made a devastating trade, exchanging the glory of the immortal God for dead idols. We incurred an infinite legal debt we cannot pay because we possess no antallagma, no substitute of equal value.
We are completely insolvent.
And we are in desperate need of an Apallassō, a legal severing of this hostility, a tearing up of the debt we owe, and that leaves humanity in a state of absolute objective alienation from the Creator. The gap between us and God is wide open, and the relationship is defined by hostility and wrath.
This leads us directly to the absolute core of the Christian message. How is that hostility resolved? How do we get peace?
This brings us to a crucial linguistic fork in the road, where we analyze two incredibly distinct words for peace and reconciliation. Allassō and Apallassō. Let us start with the horizontal piece, the human level, which is Allassō.
The prefix dia often means through or implies a crossing over between 2 points, a mutual exchange. Allassō refers to mutual, horizontal reconciliation between two parties.
We see it used once in the New Testament in Matthew 5.24, where Jesus is teaching about anger and human conflict during the Sermon on the Mount.
He says, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift.
That action of being reconciled to your brother is Allassō. The historical papyri provide a wonderful, incredibly human context here. We have access to an ancient papyrus letter written by an errant, rebellious son to his angry mother.
Oh, that letter is fascinating.
In the letter, he is begging her for Allassō. He's asking for a mutual laying down of arms.
The mechanics of that ancient letter mirror exactly how our human conflicts work today. It describes a two-way street. In a horizontal human relationship, whether it is a son and a mother or two co-workers or a married couple, both parties have to overcome a degree of hostility.
The son has to repent of his wandering and adjust his behavior, and the mother has to renounce her anger and adjust her posture. It is a mutual movement toward the center to establish a treaty.
Even if one person is 90% at fault, both people have to contribute to bridging the gap. Both people have to lay down their weapons to achieve genuine, lasting peace.
Right, there's a mutual contingency to the peace, but that is Allassō. When the Apostle Paul sits down to describe the peace achieved between God and humanity, he does not use Allassō.
He reaches for a different, significantly heavier theological term, katallassō. The prefix kata in Greek composition often intensifies a word, indicating a definitive downward motion or something comprehensive, final, and absolute.
We see this massive, heavily weighted word deployed in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 18 through 20, and in Romans chapter 5, verse 10. And the contrast between the mutual human peace of Allassō and the divine peace of katallassō is absolute.
The contrast is jarring, especially when you look at the religious context of the first century.
Oh, the pagan religions?
Yeah, in the pagan Greek and Roman religions of the time, the gods were notoriously fickle and frequently angry. If a river flooded or a plague hit, the assumption was that the local deity was furious.
Therefore, human beings had to offer sacrifices, pour out libations, and perform rituals to reconcile the angry gods to themselves.
The humans initiated the peace process in order to change the deity's mood from wrathful to favorable. The human action manipulated the divine reaction.
But Paul's use of katallassō completely flips this pagan paradigm on its head.
The reversal is the bedrock of understanding the gospel. In the New Testament, God is never the object being reconciled. Let me state that with absolute clarity based on the grammatical structure of these texts. God does not reconcile himself to us. God reconciles us to himself.
The supremacy, the sovereignty, and the unchangeable nature of God are maintained entirely. He does not change his mind or alter his character.
We were the enemies. We were the ones standing under the objective, just reality of divine wrath due to our idolatrous rebellion. Yet God is the sole initiator, the sole architect, and the sole financier of the peace treaty. He crosses the line into enemy territory to establish the peace that the enemy could not and would not establish.
That represents a staggering paradigm shift for the human mind to grasp. The offended party, the one who holds all the legal rights, all the capital, and all the moral high ground, is the one who bears the cost to establish the peace with the offender.
And the source material makes a point to explain that this concept of reconciliation is more comprehensive than just the legal concept of justification.
Justification is a legal term. It means the removal of guilt, the clearing of the ledger in the courtroom. It means the debt is canceled.
But you can have your debt canceled by a bank, and you still do not invite the bank manager over for dinner. Canceled debt is not friendship.
Apallassō, reconciliation, is a total state change. It moves us from being hostile enemies to being adopted family.
That distinction between the legal clearing of guilt and the relational kindling of love is essential to grasp. Romans 5 says that while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his son.
It changes the total state of the individual's life. It moves a person from standing under the shadow of divine wrath to having the love of God poured into their heart through the Holy Spirit.
The Theological Dictionary notes a fascinating nuance. While faith is inherently tied to justification, Paul does not explicitly mention human faith when he is defining the objective accomplishment of reconciliation in Romans 5 or 2 Corinthians 5.
Really, he leaves the human action out entirely in those definitions.
He focuses heavily on the objective historical work of God in Christ that brings about a completely new creation. The sinful self-seeking that defined the old nature is overcome by a new nature. The hostility is replaced by a living, breathing communion.
This is a present objective reality achieved entirely by the death of Jesus, who stood as our representative substitute. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, That is how the unpayable debt from Romans 1, the lack of an antallagma, is legally and relationally handled.
But this brings up a massive theological paradox that I constantly wrestle with, and I know our listeners do too.
If God is the sole architect of this peace, if he initiates it, pays the infinite debt, and does all the reconciling work objectively at the cross, then how do we handle human agency?
Because right after Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 that God reconciled us to himself through Christ, he turns around in verse 20 and begs the readers, "We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God."
If God already did all the reconciling, why is Paul begging people to do it? It feels like a contradiction.
It is a phenomenal question that strikes the heart of how God interacts with the human will. The source material provides a very precise grammatical nuance to answer it. Man is not a passive block of wood in this transaction.
We do not receive reconciliation the way a stone receives rain.
Because God is dealing with conscious human persons, he engages our will. The insight here is that God's sovereign action makes man active. Through the ministry of reconciliation, through the outward preaching of the gospel, God grants humans the internal capacity, the right, and the spiritual life to accept this new reality.
The grammar Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 5.2 and 0 is critical. It's a passive imperative verb. It literally translates to let yourselves be reconciled to God.
You are not being asked to generate the peace. You are being asked to drop your weapons and accept the peace that has already been objectively achieved, financed, and secured by God.
You cannot create the reconciliation, but you must enter into the experience of it. Let yourselves be reconciled. That passive grammar is the key that unlocks the paradox. Let me try a different analogy here.
Go for it.
Think of a defector trapped deep behind enemy lines during a brutal Cold War. The defector is stuck, under heavy guard, completely incapable of saving himself. His home country decides to rescue him.
Okay, the state initiates the action.
Yes, the sovereign government plans the extraction. They finance the operation. They send a covert team across the border. They neutralize the hostile guards. They secure the perimeter, and they land a helicopter right in the courtyard where the defector is standing.
The extraction has been objectively achieved by the home country.
The pilot opens the door and yells to the defector, "Get in." The defector did not plan the mission, did not fly the chopper, and did not neutralize the guards. But he still has to physically step onto the helicopter.
The home country achieved the rescue. The defector must actively step into it. He cannot sit in the courtyard, refuse to board the chopper, and experience the rescue.
That analogy tracks beautifully with the biblical data. The defector's act of stepping onto the helicopter adds zero objective value to the extraction mission itself. He cannot take credit for the rescue just because he lifted his foot.
The mission was already perfect and complete, entirely funded and executed by the sovereign authority. But stepping onto the chopper is the necessary, active experience of the rescue.
God uses human messengers, Paul, the apostles, the church, to deliver the terms of the treaty to the courtyard. The reconciliation of the individual is a concluded fact in the mind of God, achieved at the cross. But it is applied in time and space when the messenger speaks the word and the hostile rebel is awakened by the Spirit to drop their weapons and step onto the chopper.
We have tracked this linguistic family tree from the mundane act of changing clothes in an ancient laundry to the horrific economic exchange of idolatry in Rome, to the unpayable debt requiring debtor's prison, to the magnificent asymmetrical peace God establishes with hostile rebels.
But the writers of the New Testament were not done stretching this word. They had one more conceptual boundary to push. And that brings us to the longest, most comprehensive variation of our root word. Apallassō.
This word is massive, both in its literal spelling and its theological scope. You only find it in the letters written by Paul to the Colossians and the Ephesians, specifically Colossians chapter 1, verses 20 and 22, and Ephesians chapter 2, verse 16.
And when you look at the historical lexicons, they suggest something incredible.
Yeah.
You do not find this specific compound word anywhere in Greek literature before Paul. He appears to have coined this massive neologism himself. The standard vocabulary of the entire Greek language was insufficient for what he needed to articulate.
Which tells you something about the sheer scale of the concept he is trying to communicate. In Greek, when you stack prefixes, you multiply the force and the scope of the root verb.
We already discussed Apallassō, the definitive, downward-moving, asymmetrical reconciliation initiated by God. By adding the prefix af to the very front of it, Paul creates a term that suggests a reconciliation that brings things completely back from a state of deep alienation into an original state of pristine harmony.
The linguistic analysis of this specific word reveals two massive conceptual expansions from everything we have discussed so far. The first is an expansion of the subject doing the reconciling.
In our previous discussions at Apallassō, God the Father alone is the subject who reconciles. But in Apallassō, Christ is explicitly brought in as the active subject alongside the Father.
Colossians 1 notes that God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Christ and through him to reconcile all things. The peacemaking work is perfectly harmoniously shared between the Father and the Son in the hypostatic union.
The first expansion is structural, but the second expansion is just breathtaking in its scope. It is the expansion of the object being reconciled.
Throughout this entire conversation, we have been focused on individual human beings, the rebel in the cell, the patient with the disease, the defector in the courtyard.
We tend to think of salvation as a highly individualized, localized rescue mission. But with Apallassō, Paul completely blows the walls off our localized theology. The object of this reconciliation is no longer just individual human souls. It is the entirety of the created cosmos.
Colossians 1.20 says, "And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross." This encompasses the entire physical universe.
Ephesians 2 uses the exact same word to describe the breaking down of the ancient, dividing sociological wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles, merging them into one new humanity. It even extends to the superterrestrial realm, the invisible powers, authorities, and principalities.
We must be incredibly careful to define what this cosmic reconciliation means according to the parameters set by the text itself. Throughout history, some scholars have tried to interpret this cosmic scope as just the forced subjection of all things to Christ, a sort of military surrender where the rebellious angels and the broken universe are just pinned to the ground under the boot of a conqueror.
But the lexical data explicitly refutes that limitation. The text explicitly defines this action as making peace. It is not just the establishment of a rigid chain of command over a resentful populace. It is the total structural restoration of all fractured elements of the universe.
We have to remember that the fall of man in Genesis 3 did not just introduce sin into the human heart. The curse fractured the ground, bringing forth thorns and thistles. It fractured the animal kingdom, introducing predation and fear. It tore the very fabric of the physical universe, subjecting all of creation to futility, as Paul writes in Romans 8.
So the damage was cosmic, meaning the repair has to be cosmic.
Exactly. Apallassō declares that the cross of Christ is not just the place where individual sins are forgiven. It is the epicenter of a cosmic shockwave that will put the entire fractured universe back together.
Every atom, every biological ecosystem, every sociological relationship, every spiritual boundary that was broken by the introduction of sin is going to be brought back into perfect, singing harmony under the headship of Christ.
That answers my earlier question of why Paul had to invent a brand new word. If you are a first-century writer staring at the entire catalog of the Greek language, looking for a way to describe an event that reaches all the way back to the dawn of time, reaches up to the highest invisible spiritual realms, reaches down into the dirt and bedrock of the earth, and stretches forward into the eternal future to fix every broken thing everywhere all at once, well, a word used for changing your shirt at laundry just is not going to cut it.
Even a word used for a human political treaty falls incredibly short. The sheer terrifying scale of the cross required breaking human language to fit the reality. Paul had to step into the linguistic forge and hammer out a new tool to carry the weight of a reconciled universe.
It is the linguistic equivalent of astronomers realizing they have to build an entirely new, massive telescope because the old lenses simply cannot handle the scope and spectrum of the light coming from a newly discovered galaxy.
The cross demands a vocabulary of total cosmic repair. It tells you that the salvation secured by Christ is not a narrow, localized evacuation plan. He is not abandoning the ship of the universe. He is reclaiming it.
The physical world matters. The stones, the birds, the human body, the structural order of society, all of it is caught up in this massive, unstoppable movement of Apallassō. The original material of creation will be maintained, but its nature will be fundamentally altered and renovated to reflect the indestructible life of the resurrected Christ.
We have covered an immense amount of conceptual ground today, moving from the microscopic to the macroscopic. We started by looking at a simple, everyday root word, alas, which the ancients used for the physical alteration of everyday objects, swapping out cracked stones in a wall, changing garments, altering a tone of voice.
We watched that neutral word turn incredibly dark when humanity utilized metalas to exchange the glory of the Creator for dead idols, bankrupting our nature in a catastrophic economic trade.
We hit the brick wall of our inability to pay the antallagma, the equivalent ransom price for our soul, leaving us in desperate need of a legal eviction notice, and Apallassō, to sever the contractual claim of our rebellion and disease.
And then we witness the breathtaking grace of God, who did not wait for us to negotiate a mutual horizontal peace, but unilaterally enacted Apallassō, paying our infinite debt, crossing enemy lines, and granting us the capacity to receive his pardon.
And finally, we saw how Paul stretched human language to its absolute breaking point with Apallassō, revealing that God's peacemaking ambition will not stop until the entire fractured cosmos is brought into perfect harmony.
The trajectory of the single-word family is a perfect, flawless mirror for the trajectory of biblical history. It tracks the narrative arc from creation to the fall to redemption and finally to complete cosmic consummation.
It shows us that every aspect of our existence is defined by exchange and alteration, and that our only hope is that God is the sovereign architect orchestrating the final permanent exchange. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to carry with you today.
We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing a linguistic map of how God handles hostility.
Our entire spiritual reality, our very existence as reconciled people who can breathe and have hope, relies on a unilateral exchange where God traded his perfection for our hostility without asking for our prior permission. He stepped across the line while we were still active enemies, gripping our weapons.
So, if that asymmetrical grace is the bedrock of your reality, how does that dictate how you approach the people in your own life whom you consider your enemies?
If the entire cosmos is being actively and aggressively brought into peace by the blood of the cross, how can we possibly justify clinging to petty horizontal hostilities?
If God has initiated the grand cosmic reconciliation at infinite cost to himself, perhaps we are called to be the ones who take the first step, bearing the cost in our smaller ones.
Keep questioning, keep reading, and keep learning.